Welcome back as we continue our look at the book of Leviticus. As I mentioned last time, this time we're going to look at the various words that Leviticus uses for sin. And again, as we talked in the last video, if you think of chapters 1 to 15 dealing with issues with purity laws, clean and unclean, and chapters 17 to 27 dealing with violations of the holiness code, so we start to see that structure works out not just in the broader way, but even in the very use of the very words for the law. We tend to call it the law when there's actually, again, various words that describe the holiness laws and those words that describe the purity laws. And so if we again think about in the Reformed three forms of the law: the moral, abiding law, eternal, because it's the very nature and character of God. There are words that the law uses to describe that, and sins that violate that. And then if we think about the purity laws, we have words that describe those commandments dealing with the ceremonial and civil law, and words that describe those laws. So violations and laws we can think of, but we need to see that the law uses distinct words for it. And so if we think about it, these are the words that are used, 7 different words. So we can think of asham, chata, ma'al, avel, avon, pesha, and shagag. Now, I can say that and you'd think, whatever is he talking in tongues about? So let's think about these various types of words. So asham is to incur guilt. And we can see that the majority of these, with 2 exceptions, all occur in chapters 1 to 15. So you've incurred this type of guilt because you have become unclean, and ways in which this can be dealt with. And then the word that throughout the Old Testament is generally translated sin in English Bibles, chata, again occurs predominantly in the book of Leviticus, and I say predominantly, in chapters 1 to 15, with several in chapter 16, which is the Day of Atonement, and dealing with how to remove the impurity that you're incurring. Impurity has been transmitted to the sanctuary, so that needs to be dealt with on the Day of Atonement. And then there are a handful of uses in the latter half, in what is the so-called holiness code. And what we'll find when we get there is that it's by and large using it in its more general sense and not so much in the technical sense. And then you have this word ma'al. Ma'al is covenant rebellion. It is to break the covenant, to breach of covenant. We can think of the book of Joshua, for example. We see it twice, where the covenant has been breached by the sin of the people. Well, to be clear, it's been breached once, but then there's been an assumed breach of it. So the first time is when Achan rebels against God, stealing from him. He has breached the covenant. And then at the end of the book, when the Transjordanian tribes, so those tribes that had taken land on the east side of the Jordan, were returning, they built an oversized altar, not to be used, but as a testimony to remind the so-called Cisjordanian, or those tribes west of the Jordan, that they too were Israelites. And so these are there is this thought of, oh no, these tribes, they've returned to the east side of the Jordan, now they've rebelled and they're setting up their own religion just by setting up an altar. And so they are preparing to either wipe them out for breaching the covenant, like happened to Achan, or to force them to come back. And then when they said, no, this is a memorial not to be used, it was dealt with. Then we have the word avel, which is injustice. And where we find this word is twice in Leviticus 19, and it's talking about social law, dealing with the civil law, but it's talking about definable acts of injustice. So it's not, as we would have in modern culture, social justice where microaggressions, perceived aggressions, but it's actually oppressing the weak, the poor, the widow, the orphan. And then we have avon, which is usually translated iniquity. It has the idea of turning aside from the law, and it occurs in both halves, but the predominant use is, again, in the holiness code. So iniquity has to deal with violations of the moral law. And then rebellion, pesha, is in the regulations for the Day of Atonement. And then finally we have shagog. Shagog means, and it's generally connected to the earlier one we saw, chata, or sin, so to sin unintentionally. So it sees that you've accidentally incurred this. So you're walking along and you're not paying attention to what you're doing, you trip over the corpse of a dead animal, you have inadvertently incurred ritual impurity. So you're not going out there trying to bring about or to do things. It's an oopsie. It's not an intentional sin. Or as it will talk about in Numbers, for example, a sin with a high hand, an intentional sin. Now, so we have these 7 words that are used and distributed between the 2 halves of the book of Leviticus, dealing with ritual impurities, dealing with violations of the moral law. But what we also find in there is that we have the consequences for these sins, and they use different words to describe who is doing the sin. And what we find is that these subjects, so we can think of the soul who sins, the man who sins, the human who sins. And so we have these. And what we find is that the use of human or man, so ish or adam, who sins, is tied up with the external. It's tied up again with the ceremonial law, and so it's the external, the physicality of it. So that again, it's removing the concept that these violations of the purity laws are moral and dealing with the depths of the human being. It's just dealing with, this is what it is to be a human. You are going to become ritually defiled and need to go through the cleansing rituals, whether it's the ritual bath so that you're clean by the evening, or the sacrifices for those sins. And what's intriguing is the penalty for such is invariably death, because it's dealing with the external. So the body has done these things, the body must pay the penalty if you do not use the proper ritual. But then when we get to the matters dealing with the soul, dealing with the moral law, Leviticus is again incompetent to make remedy. And this incompetence goes down to the incompetence of human beings to adjudicate the remedy, and thus the penalty is to be cut off. So and so shall be cut off for this and cast out from the community of Israel, the congregation of Israel. So again, we see that excommunication is for humans to let go of the adjudication of it and to leave that unto God. And so one final concept for this video I want to deal with is, as I mentioned earlier, not only are the words for sin restricted to this either the ceremonial law, so we can think of become ritually impure, which needs a sin offering, which is literally a purgation or a cleansing offering, or it is sins dealing with the moral law, which requires, according to the Levitical system, excommunication, being sent outside the camp for these things. The laws are again done that. So, for example, we have statutes. Now, the word statutes are principles of conduct. So, the walk, to keep, to do, are dealing with the moral law. So, we find these in Leviticus 17 to 27, dealing with the moral law. And then we get the idea of Torot, where we get the word Torah from. These are refers to ritual instructions, the instruction on how to keep yourself ritually pure, that God may dwell in the midst of Israel and not break out against them and bring death to the whole community. And then over top of this, we have the word mitzvot, mitzvah. You might, bar mitzvah that you might hear from, it's to become a son of that. Well, mitzvah is this overarching category that covers both the Torot, the ritual instructions, and the hukot, or the hukim, the statutes, which are dealing with the moral law. And God enjoins Israel to keep them both. And we see that as they go along, the ritual impurity mounts up in the sanctuary, such to the point that it becomes an abomination before God, so he departs. We see this in the book of Ezekiel. And we see that their sins, their rebellions, their violations of the moral law come such to the point that God exiles them. He expels them. He excommunicates Israel from the land. And we'll deal with how Leviticus looks to the restoration of this when we get to chapter 26. Thank you for joining us, and join us next time as we continue our look at the book of Leviticus.